Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2024 BHECN Core Topics webinar series. My name is Katie Quartz, and I'm a licensed psychologist at the University of Nebraska Medical Center and the Associate Director of Education and Training for the Behavioral Health Education Center of Nebraska, also known as BHECN. On behalf of the Planning Committee, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you today. We're very excited that you're here, and we hope that you enjoy the webinar that we have planned. Our speaker today is Michael Stubbe. Michael Stubbe is a licensed professional counselor and licensed mental health practitioner with Western Nebraska Behavioral Health. He is also a doctoral student in the Counselor Education Graduate Program at Oregon State University. He has traveled and worked in rural towns throughout the panhandle of Nebraska, helping to address a wide range of client needs. He has helped connect rural areas with expanded care through coordination with an outreach genetics clinic and an outreach pediatric psychiatry clinic. His work has primarily focused on providing rural integrated care with a special interest working with clients within the LGBTQIA+ community and technology integration and counseling. Michael will be presenting today on Going Digital, Keeping Pace with Technology as a Clinician. Please give a warm welcome to Michael.
So I just wanted to kind of provide some of the similar information about me and what I've been doing for the last couple of years. So I'm originally from a small town in Nebraska near Omaha. And I moved to Chadron for my undergraduate, and then I ended up doing my master's at CSC2, where I got my degree in clinical mental health counseling in 2019. And I've been working as a clinician with Western Nebraska Behavioral Health since then. Most of my practice has been with the rural areas, and I've been kind of all over the panhandle working through several clinics, although the last few years I've been working completely through telehealth. In 2022, I started my degree in counselor education, and my research has been focused on telehealth with rural populations and the interaction with counselors that work with rural population. So I will be covering quite a few things during this presentation, but it will focus on 3 factors that create challenges for effective use of counselors for clinicians, whether it be common issues that clinicians run into, missteps or issues related to location, and then I'll kind of expand to practice issues that can come up with technology. I'll also make sure to cover 3 ethical issues that arise when working from home or working digitally, ranging from privacy issues during sessions to HIPAA compliance. And I will also discuss some resources that will be helpful when providing online services. And I kind of split this presentation into 3 parts where I talk about working from home, and then I move into the business side of technology, and I end it talking a little bit about AI considerations because it's just been such a huge topic of conversation recently, and I think it's going to become an increasing part of both just technology in general and integrate further into counseling as time goes on. First, I'll start with just some important terminology that's going to come up through this, and then come up with just any use of technology. So I really chose these several terms because they're important when working with tech and behavioral health, and especially when it comes to providing telehealth in whatever form you decide to work in. These are often thrown around. These terms are often thrown around, and sometimes people have a vague understanding of what they mean, especially when it comes to kind of where the client's understanding is. So I'm going to start with encryption. In its most simple term, encryption just scrambles information. It splits it up when it gets sent out and then puts it back together so that the people who need access and want to have access to it can, while anyone outside of that group doesn't have access, especially when it's between devices or it's in the cloud. This is something that's really extremely important when it comes to online safety. But it doesn't really matter if the physical device is just open and unprotected or doesn't have passwords on. So I'm going to get a little technical at first, and then as we go on, we'll be coming more into just how they work in practice. But first off, the information, when it gets encrypted, is turned into a coded set of information that can only be accessed through like specific keys or passwords. And it's an important part of HIPAA compliance because it allows for private information, private client information to be protected, and it helps prevent it from being hacked if someone gets into like an EMR or something like that. And so encryption is something that's extremely widespread on digital files, and it's used on digital records, emails, text messages, websites, video chats, basically any form of online communication it's used during. To get into just a little bit further technical detail, encryption is done using an algorithm that alters what we write, or what we would call the plain text, or the regular information, and puts it into ciphertext, which is the coded, scrambled, and then it's decoded back into plain text for us. This also is something that you see on essentially every website that you use, with the HTTPS that's at the top of the URL. And you'll really know, you'll be able to know if a website is encrypted because it'll have a little padlock up at the top. And that's just a way to tell if the website is safer and if it protects your login information. So I'm going to move a little bit on to HIPAA. And so this is where things get a little more confusing in terms of what is required, what's looked at. And technically, encryption isn't required, but it's in an area called addressable. And what that really means is that if you don't encrypt your information, or you don't have a service that encrypts your information, you have to provide a document that tells what steps are taken to make sure that it is safe and it is secure. And in most practices and most, even personal, encryption is just easier than providing this document, because it's tough to keep the information safe without those encryption in place. So a lot of what I'll be talking about later is the services that counselors connect with, the behavioral health professionals connect with, that allow for HIPAA compliance, or that have been shown to be HIPAA compliant. And most of these will be shown through what's called a business associate agreement, or a BAA. And if you see that, usually it's going to be a viable choice for behavioral health care. Some of examples of emails that are HIPAA compliant are Google Workspace, Hushmail, or ProtonMail. Although a lot of those miss out on the key features that we would want as a behavioral health service. And then I'll touch on some better ones later that are more specific for behavioral health. And so one thing to keep in mind when it comes to what HIPAA asks is that it looks for different things based on if the data is transmitted versus if it's just sitting on your device. And so that's what we would call at-rest data, which means that it is sitting on a device, a physical device, and that needs to be protected through some sort of authentication codes or login credentials, all the way up to full device encryption, which is something that is very much for people who want the full length of safety, but it's a little bit tougher to implement. And for transmitted data, which is just data that we send in any way communicated through the internet or online, it asks that it be sent through encryption for the most safety. So I'm going to talk a little bit, just kind of pulling it back from the technical stuff to telehealth, because this is something that I think we've all interacted with in one way or another. And there are a few different definitions, and they kind of change over time. Later on, I'll kind of reference when it comes to what the interface is as video conferencing technology, or VCT. And that's really just where are you getting your video sent between. And then when it comes to specifically telehealth, there are a few names that are synonymous, but I will be describing it through telehealth. Some of the other ones are telepsychiatry, telepsychology, telemedicine, telemental health, or teletherapy. But most of the times those describe specific forms of telehealth more so than kind of the broader idea. So as I said, almost all of us have kind of worked with telehealth in one way or another, but if a client had heard all of these different forms, it might be a little confusing for them. So that's why I tend to stick to telehealth. And while I won't be diving too much into this topic today, there's also a question if online audio and text messaging falls within telehealth, but they're usually considered separate. Although text-based therapy has had a growing interest, it's still very much young though. So I'm going to jump over to bandwidth because this is one of those things that is important for the clinic, the clinician and the client to have a little bit of understanding of, because it really impacts digital communication, especially in rural areas. So many of us have used this personally and in counseling to describe our ability to deal with a situation or obligations and let people know that we need some rest. But when it comes to digitally, it's something that really is sitting in the background, but can completely change how a session goes. So this can be really important when it comes to at a clinic, if you're having multiple clinicians on the same internet, on the same router, and even at home, if you have multiple people at home when you're working. And when it comes to rural areas, there's a big difference in speeds, and I'll talk about that a little later. But one thing that'll get in the way is if you have a lot of stuff going, if you have your video conference app going, if you have an online EMR in the background, or you just have online background processes going like notifications, you have a browser open, that all impacts what you can do on the computer. So I would say that this is best defined as the measurement of the amount of information that can be sent between computers and an online server. And so to give you an idea of the speeds that you should have, it depends on the size of your organization. And at the end of this, I'm going to include a link to a place where you can test your speed to just kind of see where you're at. At minimum, when it comes to smaller clinics, and these will be things that are shown when you sign up for internet services, or you can ask your internet provider what your speeds are. But the bare minimum recommended for a smaller clinic is 25 megabits per second. And megabits per second doesn't matter that much in terms of the explanation. It just shows how much speed you have. And the most important reason why this speed is because this allows for both HD video and having a background EMR going. And it's important to be aware of what kind of speeds that your clients might have. The average speed and bandwidth in Nebraska is around 40 megabits per second, but it can be quite a bit slower in rural areas, while more populated areas like Omaha or larger cities can go all the way up to 500 megabits per second and to 1,000. So it's a big difference in what you're seeing. And when you see those like slower than 40 megabits, sometimes it can mean that things will stutter. Sometimes you'll lose video, audio will cut out. And so it really just impacts what you're looking at in your session. So now that we got a lot of this technical jargon and this terminology out of the way, I'm going to jump more into talking about working from home and some of just the tips, the tricks, issues you might run into, and how to kind of set up the best work from home scenario. So yeah, I think in counseling and behavioral health, privacy is going to be your first thing that you have to consider. It is so important, and it changes quite a bit when you're going from home or an office or anyone else you're working. This list could go on for a long time, but the most important things are looking for those differences that pop up between the office and between home to protect yourself and to protect clients. So here are some things that I'm going to talk about that you should be aware of testing and be aware of when working from home. So offices are often built in a certain way to kind of help with the privacy, whether it be thicker walls, where homes might have thin walls or be connected directly to another room. And so this isn't something that we can just change very easily. So a lot of the times it can be helped through white noise machines, soundproofing materials on walls, and they sell those online. They're usually these black kind of egg holder looking things that you can stick to your walls, and they help buffer the sound. And even strategic placement of desks can help make sure that the sound is kind of traveling in a certain direction. Working from home also comes with some issues that don't end up being in the office because people might knock on your door, whether it be looking for a delivery or doing work on the house. And just a small recommendation for that is they have those automated doorbells. And what you can do with those automated doorbells is you can have it so after 5 seconds, it tells them a message, we need you to come back later, or we're not available. And that makes it so someone's not knocking at your door for 10 minutes during the day, and you either have to pause the session or you have to ignore it and have that go on in the background. Another thing that can happen at home is family members at home during the session might come knock. If they aren't aware of what's going on, or they're young, they might come in. And so really just having a really just direct conversation, putting out the rules, however you can do that, to let them know that once your door is closed, it's off limits. Some of the more unique problems that come up are things like, you have the plumbers come over, HVAC, electricians, and they can work on the home during the day. And while this might be a distraction in the background occasionally with noise, it can be really helpful to have times scheduled during your day, like an open morning or an open afternoon, that is completely set aside. So you don't have to worry about trying to do your session, or if you can, having a family member at home or prior set up with them so they know they can come in. One thing that I wanted to add that is actually a little odd is just talking about open windows. Because sometimes we like some airflow, and a thing that comes with that is that passerbys might be able to hear just bits of the conversation and kind of hurt the privacy. And I kind of touch more in depth on this later, but part of the things that help that is I would recommend just never having a meeting where you don't have some sort of headphones in. Another aspect that kind of goes along with what we were talking about earlier is how you save information. A big recommendation would be having a specific work-only computer that's password protected, so no one in the house can access anything on it, and they know that it's kind of this set-aside device. So a very interesting thing that I think is coming up more and more is digital privacy. And so this is something to be really aware of with home devices, like the Google Nest or Alexa or an Apple Home, as they have these passive and active listening modes. And so the passive mode is looking for a specific trigger phrase, which I won't say so people's devices will go off. But when it hears that phrase, then it starts to record. And those recordings can sometimes be listened to by another human being, which completely breaks the privacy. And another big part of that is it might interrupt your session if you have it on the background. And they often will go off when they hear something that even sounds sort of like their trigger phrase, which will interrupt. And then you have the issue of privacy that it comes back to. And so one thing that's become increasingly used just between devices, especially with like the Apple ecosystem, is that cloud file sharing, where you save something on one computer and then it's on other devices. And so I would be very aware of that and either have it turned off or have it so it is not shared, and you can do all that through settings. This is more of a security thing that I'm going to mention next, but it's something to keep in mind if you're using your work laptop in a public area. And that's just that you should be really cautious when connecting to public Wi-Fi, as they will have access to your internet traffic, and at worst case scenario, they're able to get access to your passwords and files. Most of the time this doesn't happen, but it's one of those things to be really aware of because there is that possibility. I'm going to move on to tech literacy a little bit. I would define this as the ability to effectively use technology and to be able to find, create, and communicate through digital systems. So this kind of is a really broad thing, but includes knowledge about computers, programs, even video presence. And there are a lot of different levels of interaction with technology when working with clients through telehealth, especially if they are completely online clients. I kind of break this apart in different steps because there are several steps that a client has to jump through to get to the session, to get to working. So first, they have to fill out the paperwork. And if they're completely online, or you are moving towards no paper at all, this will be done through an online portal where they have to sign on. Usually they have to make an account of some sort. And they do this, on their phones, on their computers, or on their tablets. And there's just so much variability between these. So past that, one thing to consider is that they're even going to be on the same device in different browsers. And so that might throw up a host of different issues that they'll run into that you have to kind of be aware of. Not only do they have to work with the browsers, but once they're into the portal, they have to figure out drop-down menus, fill-in bars, signatures, and depending on their level of tech literacy, it's going to make it really tough. And that's just getting signed up, getting ready. After that, they have to navigate to whatever video conferencing service you use. whether that have updates or browser struggles. Uh, so this is just something that as clinicians, often we have to be more familiar with these services than other people because we'll have a client reach out to us and they'll need some troubleshooting and we'll have to help explain what they need to do. And so that shows kind of our tech literacy and our competency. So I'm going to jump a little ahead and just kind of recommend that as a clinician, you really experiment and as a clinic have a test client. So someone that is put into the system that they can sign on to from another computer and see what it looks like to be a client. So see the pages they see what it looks like when they're joining, because often it looks completely different than what the clinician is seeing. And not knowing what they're jumping into is going to cause some headaches on both of people's ends. And so something that can be helpful for clinics is having both a clinic-wide training where you talk through, you go through it, you show what it looks like, talking to clients one-on-one and just kind of assessing those skills, seeing if they run into a lot of issues. And we're going to hit a wide range of clients in terms of their tech literacy. And we want to make it as straightforward as possible for them to get through the sessions. So next, I'm going to kind of jump to body language because it is a really important consideration. And this is something that every behavioral health practitioner is kind of drilled and hammered in on to be aware of. And it is completely different when using telehealth. So during in-person sessions, we have the ability to see their entire body, how they're sitting, if their arms are crossed, how tense their hands are. We see all of this information, but on screen, we only see from the shoulder up, and our focus is on their faces, our focus is on their voices. And I'll touch on this a little bit later. Technology has another piece when it comes to facial expressions and appearance that gets altered through the apps that we use and through our phone. So it is kind of common for clients when they jump on the telehealth. If they're jumping on from their phone, it can sway. They can put it down for a second and you can't even see them. It might not even be shoulders. It may just be a close-up of their face. And so I would recommend whenever possible, if they do have a computer, having them meet from their computer because it's stationary for the most part, and they can set it down where they can lean back and talk. And kind of on that note, the best experience that I have with clients is that they're sitting on their couch, they're sitting in a chair, and they have their laptop, they have their computer sitting down on a coffee table in front of them, and they're sitting a few feet back so they can show, you can see their whole body, they can move around naturally. And then coming back to the clinician side, being aware of where your camera is super important. And the range of what the camera shows. So if you're using another monitor, you might look off to the side and appear distracted. Or if you have notifications pop up, they might feel confused because you aren't looking at the place you had been looking before. And they may not feel like you're paying attention to them. And I would say that just, we are very conscious of our body language. But when we're online, when we're going through this, being aware of our facial expressions is a little bit more important on this. Yeah. So I'm going to jump into just a small touch on regulations because this is something that there is, data privacy laws, there's insurance expectations, there's national, regional, and state regulations on telehealth practices further than just HIPAA. And these are things that change sometimes really quickly, sometimes don't have a lot of notice. And I would recommend more than anything being really up to date and being active with your professional organizations, whether that be places like the Nebraska Counseling Association, APA, ACA. I would say the state organizations are probably your best bet when it comes to being active because they do take a close look at the new laws being put in place and new regulations. And they usually send out pretty active emails about any changes that might come up. I'm going to move on to some tips and tricks at home. So I'm going to start with automation, and this is something I'm going to dive quite a bit more into later. And I would say this is anecdotal, but a lot of the times in telehealth, there's an increased missed session population, more so than in person. And I'm going to jump into some specific programs as we go on that help to send automatic text messages, automatic emails to save time from the counselor from having to send those out every day and to make sure that clients are reminded. A lot of them are going to be built into your email. They might be built into the video conferencing tool or your EMR. And then connecting it to a calendar is something that most of these can do too. And that's really helpful because it allows both your clinic to see, you to see, and have the automatic movement between them both. Some of them even allow for clients to reschedule or ask and request a session if they need one. And these stop clinicians from having to send out, 20 emails a day to clients. And it also helps with updates to paperwork. If there needs to be new releases, if a client turns 19 and they need new paperwork, a lot of these systems will have an automatic response go out and keep us from having to put our kind of headspace and our bandwidth into that. And it'll also help us from making the silly mistakes where we send the wrong time or we send an incorrect link or anything like that. And then another piece of automation that really comes in handy is if you have an EMR where they can fill out paperwork, you don't have to worry about transferring it to a file. You don't have to worry about saving it to a computer if the email is where you do your paperwork. So I'm going to hop into what I would consider the fun stuff and talk a little bit about video and audio considerations when working from home or creating a work from home setup. I think the biggest part is to kind of understand what your camera does. Think about how wide of a range it covers and test it out as much as you can, especially with the built-in microphone. This is a small thing, but it's something, especially with Zoom, that you might consider is when you have a client with limited bandwidth, you have the ability to lower the quality on your camera from the Zoom app. And so I'm sure a lot of the others have something similar to help save it so you can have a cohesive experience. So when it comes to webcams, especially built-in ones for laptops, there is a huge range to how usable they are. I would say that the most usable ones were like from the Microsoft Surface or MacBooks. Those are usually the best quality and don't struggle as much when it comes to lighting that isn't perfect, where other ones may, make you really pale or they wash you out or things do not look good. And so I would say if someone's working from home with regular consistency, grabbing a separate webcam that plugs into your computer is really important. As time goes on, things will change, but often, there's ones that are recommended for, all the way up to 4K. And I would say at this point, that's mostly overkill because bandwidth limitations, a lot of the apps don't even support up to 4K. So it has this super, super high quality, but you're only using about half of it. And so I would say that if you're looking at webcams, looking at ones that are around 1080p are pretty good because they have the quality, they have the usability. And then anything lower than that, so there's 720p, which is just a lower quality webcam. Those ones will at some points appear really pixelated, and as the years go on, it won't hold up very well. I mentioned this earlier, but being aware of if you can turn the HD, the high quality off on the webcams is really important because you may do that with clients in a lower bandwidth area, if you're having internet struggles that day, and it can help make things a little bit smoother. And I mentioned talking kind of about how wide a camera is. And so that's called FOV or frame of view. And that's really, is my camera going to cover this space or is it going to cover a huge amount of space? And what that does is it makes you maybe less of the focus, but I really think this one's up to preference. Some of them will be uncomfortably far in on you zoomed in, which might not make for the best session. And then audio is where I think things get a little bit more complicated. I mentioned earlier that headphones are almost always a good choice. And part of that is because your computer and your webcam has a cone of where it accepts audio. So let's say I take, 6 inches to the right, I might be completely out of my laptop's ability to hear me. And so if there's any movement, it might make things kind of hard to hear for the client. And then when we don't have headphones in, there's also echo and feedback that we deal with. So Bluetooth headphones are something that I think are really convenient. They're really lightweight, especially with things like AirPods. There's several other, Raycons, those kind of things that come out. And the only downsides to those are that you have to charge them through the day. You might have one in, you might have the other one, have to switch them because they run out of battery, and the mic quality might be just variable. It might not always be great. Things might interrupt it. And depending on a whole host of circumstances, there might be considerable audio lag. And so personally, I would just recommend a good pair of wired headphones, especially if you can get a longer cord. I can't tell you how many times I've accidentally yanked my entire headphones out because I had a 3-foot cord instead of a 6-foot one. And while they keep you a little more stationary, they have the least amount of lag and are more consistent all around. So some of the things that come up when it comes to audio settings too is that in different programs, they're often going to have noise reduction. And so what that means is that it's going to filter out noises like your keyboard, air conditioner, dogs barking, so your clients don't hear it, because we have so many ambient noises, and no matter what we do, that it can interfere. And then this is just a very personal recommendation. I would recommend weekly tests of your audio levels. And that's something usually you can look at in the testing section of these apps, because there have been times where I had a client that I had to up my audio level because they couldn't hear me. And then the rest of the week, I forgot to check it. And so it sounded like I was speaking and yelling directly into my mic. One more consideration with that too is, this is, I think, something anyone does when they're going into sessions, but muting your notifications on devices, because they could hear a bunch of beeps and boops in the background. Moving on to lighting. This is one of those things that I think falls behind a lot of the time, but it's really important when it comes to long-term quality, because the more light you have, the clearer video you're going to have. And so something to be careful of is if you have like a bright open window behind you, it can cause a lot of glare in the camera. But if you have a window in front of you, it can be fantastic for light. But then the second it gets dark or you have a storm, it's going to be much harder to see you. And I would say it's not necessary, but having a small LED light or a lamp behind your computer can give you plenty of light. And a lot of them have built-in things that change colors to reflect your skin tone. And one thing that I personally have to go through is I wear glasses that reflect my screen. And so there will be times that if I don't have the lights on that I do, the client can see themselves in my glasses. And I think it just kind of be a little distraction. This is one of the things, well, these next two things are really important because they're just going to keep changing and coming up. And so it's something to consider when you're working with clients, is that there are beautifying filters set up on people's devices that will cover, face redness. They'll cover bloodshot eyes. And this might kind of cover up signs for you if you're looking for lack of sleep, if you're seeing that they're emotional. And then this is something for a really small group of people, but Apple products have implemented built-in emoticons recently on their newest update. And so if you give a thumbs up or you move your hands in a certain way, you're going to have, a blast of confetti on screen. And so I would look through those settings and turn those off, because you don't want to be having an emotional conversation, move your hands and confetti blast on the screen. So I'm going to move on to the environment. And this is something that I think is really important and a consideration for both clinicians and clients. On the clinician side, it might just be that your background has things that are distracting, but you want to have some personality, because if you have it completely empty, it might feel sterile. Back to the window bit a little bit, they might be able to see, if you have it open, see you, or your clients might be able to see people walking behind you. And again, that's just another distraction. The idea kind of would be expanded too, because your environment, while we have these noise cancellation technology, things like beeping, if it is an air conditioner that's really close by, or a fan, especially if it blows onto a physical mic, it's going to be distracting. And so trying to set things up in the office so that things aren't directly coming in sound-wise is important. For clients, this is something that I think is a really important thing to discuss before you jump in fully, because I have seen this myself. I've heard other clinicians talk about clients where they answer the phone and they have their session where they're trying to drive, or they're at home in the living room with their friends or family, or I've heard that they go to the bathroom and talk on the toilet. They answer at the store, or they lay in bed. And these are all things that really impact the session and the usability and the usefulness. I had mentioned earlier with devices that it's just really important to be aware of what's in there. So maybe not having your Google Nest, but also when it comes to smartphones, sometimes you might have your Apple device where you say, Siri, do this, and your phone will go off. And even your Apple Watch might go off in the same way. I'm going to kind of speed through this next part, but I think this is important to all of us as behavioral health workers, but self-care changes a little bit when we're working from home. So scheduling is one of those things that I think is a big plus if you are doing work from home because you have the more flexible schedule. Where the negative side of that is that they might stretch their hours into the late evening, early mornings, weekends, and having a really consistent schedule of laid out hours might help you from overstretching yourself. I would also say having an established lunch break helps because there are times that as a clinician you get caught up in notes or you get caught up having a client scheduled last minute. And it's really good to have that time to, kind of reflect, have that time to eat and get through the day. So these two next ones are kind of intertwined, but I think they're important. Bathroom breaks might be something that we forget. And so, you're trying to make it through a session, you desperately have to go to the bathroom. So having 5 minutes between sessions where you can run, having regular breaks throughout the day can really help to split things up. When you're sitting at a desk all day, there's not much change. There's no going out to the waiting room. You're just stuck at a desk. So if you have 30-minute or 45-minute sessions, having that 15 minutes, having that 30 minutes, just go for a walk or relax for a little bit so you have the break. I would say this next part is really important too, and this is something I think a lot of people recommend to their clients, is having a space that is distinct, having a separate desk space or room to help you mentally change gears through the day is so great. Going outside, and this is something coming from an introvert, sometimes when you work from home, you're exhausted after the day is done and you want to move on. And so getting some of that time where you're not just shutting down, there's some people that will wake up and start their day, they'll get ready and they'll jump directly into session. And that might just really hit you where your gears are going. And so having a routine in the morning is really important. So I'm going to move on to the business-oriented side. So yeah, I'm going to touch kind of briefly through this, but I think social media is one of those things that is really important for a growing behavioral health office. And there's so many different social media platforms that it's hard to keep track of what's going on. So I'm going to blast through these, but Facebook, it's that old one that's been around. People have used it for a long time. It is very good for sharing resources. It's very good for having events and having groups. Providing specific office information can be done really easily. And you can use it to target ads to a local area. A negative piece of this, though, is that it is much less anonymous than any other social media, so there might deter people from interacting with the page. And one thing that I'm going to touch on through these is kind of the percentages of population, because Facebook is, I want to say, 78.5% above the age of 25, which means there's very little younger interaction. So it might change how you're showing up to it. Talking about X, or formerly known as Twitter, this one's really good for briefer educational tweets, links to things, or just really small tips, and can be used for announcements. The only thing with X is that it's much more casual, it is almost completely anonymous, and the culture might not be the best fit for behavioral health services. And in terms of population, 58% of the users are under 35. So that's kind of a split where it can hit a lot of the populations. Instagram is one of those ones that's kind of connected to Facebook, but very much oriented towards photos and videos. It's great for inspirational quotes. It's great for infographics and a really good way to introduce staff. And I would say that this one is one of the ones that start to be, okay, we have to be aware of how it's used because when we're using it, you might have a staff member that needs to be more skilled in photography. Although if you have too much polish, it might seem really simulated or kind of fake. And so being careful with that. The population on that site is about 62% between 18 and 34. So it's really, really good when it comes to young adults or the early adult population. Touching on LinkedIn a bit, very different than the other ones because it is almost completely oriented towards networking and the workplace. This might be a good place to share practice updates. It might be a good place for evidence-based practices to talk about and in hiring, along with blog posts. But this one blog posts would be more oriented towards behavioral health issues that impact the workforce, like burnout, which could be good for regional network building, but it is much less oriented towards prospective clients and usually more useful for like individual clinicians that are getting into the workplace. Around 60% of the users are between 25 and 35. But I think this is a little bit less important since it's not as client facing. Just kind of be aware of that if you are posting, what language you use, what you're looking for. So these next two are the video medias. So YouTube is really good for both short and long form educational videos that can address different parts of the counseling process, psychoeducation, and coping and calming skills. One of the negatives for YouTube, though, is that it is probably the most resource intensive and requires staff that are comfortable being recorded and being online. So this is another one that has kind of an even split where 50% of the users are between 18 and 35. So kind of fitting with Instagram, it can be good to hit multiple populations. And YouTube can be kind of a backup where you link to it from your other social medias. So TikTok is very much the most popular one right now in the US. It is fantastic for short-term videos that can be educational, maybe sharing a little tour of the office or sharing quick calming skills, or even just bringing the conversation of behavioral health and addressing stigma. Although there are a few negatives when using it, because it is geared towards entertainment, it makes educational videos harder to gain traction, and someone has to be relatively skilled in videography to use it well. I would say this is a social media that some individual practitioners have gotten really viral through, but most of those are personality driven and they don't tend to drive any prospective clients to it. This is also the youngest population, with most people being under 35, and 25% are between 10 and 25, which is kind of an odd population to post for. I would say overall, when you're posting as a business, having a set of rules is really important. So there's no missteps. Separating your personal social media from your business one's really important. And keeping your posts driven by evidence helps to establish your credibility. So I'm going to pivot into talking about prospective clients and promotion to day-to-day. So customer relationship management is really what we would call electronic record keeping or electronic health record systems. And there are, features that this kind of overcomes everything. It has everything involved. Some of the most popular examples of these are therapy notes, simple practice, or out practice. And price-wise, these are between $30 and $50 a month per clinician and change depending on the level of clinician, whether they're an intern, psychologist, OHP, or psychiatrist. These systems are often separated into tiers and how you use them. So whether you use just the record keeping, just the scheduling, just the telehealth, and sometimes they will have all the features, which makes things all put together. Very efficient when it comes to sending records or reviewing information as a clinician or supervisor. And also they can submit your claims pretty cheaply. Even some of them include free claims that you can submit. A big plus I would say for all of these is that they usually have customizable note templates, so you can have a consistent note structure in your staff, and they include screeners and outcome measures that you can send to clients to help track everything there. The scheduling aspect, I would say, is one of the most helpful ones because it allows a connected clinic-wide calendar for both the clinicians, the support staff, and clients to see so that you can schedule things really smoothly. And some of them will include free reminders. And then some of them will also include payment services through it, which can make things just a little smoother on your end. And then I'll talk some more about the portals that they have. They all have these portals that clients interact with. And I think that's something that they will really be important for their experience when working online. A lot of these services have HIPAA compliant video conferencing, which makes things really smooth. You don't have to worry about if it's secure, if it's encrypted or not, because they're built in and they tell you, they go through the steps to make it like that. When it comes to looking at these, I would recommend doing a demo, running through as many as you can to make sure that you know what you're getting into. I'm going to fly through this last one because I want to touch just a little bit on AI before we end for today. But these are some additional tools that can be separated out into their own things, but are often built into their own program. HIPAA compliant texting. So this is ones with reminders, just text messaging. Sometimes they have built-in tracking, emotion tracking, journaling, compliance tracking if you give them homework. These can be from $40 to $100 a month, depending on the amount of clients you have. And I would say you as a clinician or as a business would have to be pretty oriented to making less phone calls, because this can be really tiring for a client if they're sending constant messages. So online portals, very important. The client-facing experience that they get to do with sessions. They can see future sessions. They can schedule. They can fill out paperwork, track progress. The biggest boundary to this is tech literacy. And then online interactive tools are really nice if you're working through an online service, because you can pop something up on screen and just walk through, an experience, walk through homework, a guide, sometimes, a calming video. And some recommendations. So there are things that you can find through YouTube. Therapist Aid's a really good example. And on to website considerations. The biggest thing I would say from this is that you really have to be aware of the usability of your website. How can a client find what they need to, whether it be the bios of clinicians, the services that you provide, integration with your EMR so they can pay, they can schedule. That's really going to make the experience smoother for them, and make it so when they go to the website, they're not clicking around for an hour trying to find what they need. I don't list this, but I think this is important when we're looking at affirming and accepting. Clients are looking for LGBTQIA affirming or accepting clinics. And this might be something that you list on your website, or as a clinician you list. So let's jump into AI. This has been so huge in the news that it's taking up a lot of our space. And it is coming to counseling and coming to behavioral health quickly. Most of the time when people talk about AI, they're talking about large language models, which is essentially an algorithm that processes a massive amount of information to communicate through text. The most popular ones right now are ChatGPT, which is pretty usable for anyone, Claude, which is very focused on academic research, or Poe, which aggregates different LLMs so you can look at the different things and put them together and make specific bots to do something specific. Clinically, LLMs have definitely been a question for behavioral health practice. Companies have been trying to implement note-taking apps. So Blueprint and Medalic are ones that are oriented towards making note-taking easier by recording your session and then transcribing or making an overview, subjective, objective. And even Zoom has an AI built in that takes notes, which I haven't tested, but I think it is growing over time, where symptomchecker.io is a website that's much smaller than the others. But essentially what it is you type in symptoms of a case, you type in a brief overview, and then it gives you an idea of what diagnosis it might be and what treatment. But I think this next part's going to be the most important. What are the limitations of these? Because there is a lot of fear about LLMs, partially because they're not creating new information. They're using old information and, putting those puzzle pieces together. And they are not double checked by an expert. They're not moderated like some other things are. And so a lot of them are kind of on shaky ground when it comes to privacy. And as they continue to learn, which is what these models do, is they're supposed to learn, information might be reused, and that information might not be correct. And so we have to be very careful of those changes over time. And if we ever use one for whatever purpose, double and triple checking it. I would say that it's safe to keep in mind to never put any identifiable information of any kind into these, because they do look at that information. And then another limitation that comes up with behavioral health is that there are companies trying to make AI bots that provide therapy and provide advice. And they completely lack, human feedback. They cannot be empathetic. And that really could harm clients if they're using it in a way that replaces therapy entirely. But this might change over time. There have been times they ask therapists to help train these AIs. And in the future, we might be asked through a company or otherwise to do that same thing. So I'm actually going to throw a few links in chat talking about best practices for telehealth, kind of from the government, where they recommend, some of the sites they recommend, and the apps they recommend. But I believe that is all I have for today, and we can start the question section.
Thank you, Michael. Great presentation. You covered a lot of different areas today, which was really fascinating to hear a lot of the different perspectives of how we can leverage technology within our behavioral health practices. One of the things that came to mind for me that I'd love to ask you about, especially while we're waiting for some other questions to come in, is I think we've all had that, maybe most of us had that experience where a patient or client has been otherwise occupied during a telehealth session, like on their driving, maybe down the interstate, going through the fast food window. And I think many of us are gotten comfortable with the rut of the conversation about, not going to see you right now because it seems like you're distracted, privacy concerns. But I'm wondering from your perspective, if there's how you've approached that from like putting it into your informed consent or communicating that via some of these platforms when somebody goes to schedule expectations around how they manage their privacy in the space that they're in, right? So again, I think we're comfortable addressing it in that moment, but is there anything proactively, or how do you typically handle that?
Yeah, so something that my clinic has done is we've created a specific telehealth consent form that has this list of here's some do's and here's some don'ts, because it is really good to put that out there beforehand. Because I think a lot of the time it's not even a thought for some people because they're so used to just communicating on their phones whenever or wherever they're at. And so looking through that, and I would say first session or maybe even on the phone while you're talking about setting things up, having the conversation to say, hey, let's look at this before we get going because these things will come up later. And I think just that proactive takes away maybe some of the awkwardness that we have to deal with later when we do run into those situations.
I love the idea of a consent form specific to telehealth because it makes a lot of sense why it would capture some of the nuances or things we might not necessarily observe in a traditional clinic setting. It's fantastic. Looks like we have a question in the Q&A. It says, how does licensure work if you have a telehealth patient who lives out of state?
So I believe that's one of those things, for one, very much changing over time, especially when we have the compacts between states. But most of the time it comes to you have to be licensed in that state to work with them if they are there. And I think the biggest thing is, for the most part, clinicians can be where they want, but the client has to be in the state that you're licensed. It does change when it comes to things like SIPAC, I think, later on. But I think those are all developing. And so to be safest, if you're licensed there, make sure they're in the same state. Or if you want to see clients in a different state, you can always apply for a license there uh, and make it a little bit easier.
Stick. Yeah, definitely a tricky one. I know for some individuals who work with young adults who might be going to college and, across state lines, as well as individuals who are just traveling on vacation maybe and wanting to do their therapy check-in.
I will add there are certain states that for a clinician, they give you, 15 calendar days that you can practice in the state without the license before you have to apply. But you have to look pretty in depth to make sure that you're not crossing any unintentional lines there.
Very important point. It's like we have another question in the chat. It says, doesn't the compact affect this? So to your point about the site compact.
So I'm sure it will. I don't know a ton about at the psychologist level. But if you kind of keep track of those organizations and you keep track with the compact, they can really tell you the rules. And I think this is just such a big deal because it's going to be so varied by state. But as those compacts continue to develop, they might have those same rules of you have a certain amount of time you can function in this other state. It's just one of the things that we have to look into every time we're testing it out.
Just taking a peek at the chat and the Q&A. I don't see anything else popping up just yet. I think with that, kind of lost sufficient time for typing. I think that is all of the questions for now. Michael, thank you so much for your great presentation today. We're thrilled to have you. Thank you to everyone who was able to join. We do hope that you'll join us next week in our core topic series titled Social Entrepreneurship, Resources, Ethics, and Lessons Learned. Take place next Monday from noon to 1 Central Time, and will be presented by Susan Ray, Rebecca Miller, and Kylie Phelps. Please refer to the Beacon website for more information on upcoming activities. Thank you again for your time and attention today. Thank you, Michael, for presenting, and we hope to see y'all next week.